Hello, my name's Mark Salway. I'm the Director of Sustainable Finance at Cass Business School, and I'm here to talk about cost recovery and to, if you like, sort of help you to think as charities around cost recovery and what it means. Two things before we start. The first is I used to work with organisations, commercial organisations, cleaning companies, pharmaceutical companies, and working on their cost recovery models. They made a profit. I now work with charities. It's exactly the same methodology, if you like, but we don't make a profit. And we find it hard to even recover our full costs, sometimes subsidising that with money which we get from donations, money which we get from other sources. So what I really care about is that we become more sustainable and we make sure that we cover our costs when we put in for a bid or we put in for a grant, for example. The second thing is cost recovery is the space where you start talking about business models. Cost recovery is where you start getting operations, you get marketing, you get finance coming into a space to make sure that an organisation is sustainable and properly covering their costs for the future. It ensures we have a proper infrastructure, for example. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next 25, 30 minutes. The funding landscape, I think, is the first thing we'll touch on. Then we're going to talk about what is full cost recovery. We're going to talk about current practice. We're going to build a model. We're going to talk about this thing costing versus pricing because they are not the same. We're going to touch on day rates, and it's my favourite conversation because in that one slide, hopefully I'll give you 20% more money that you can recover from donors and your funders. We're going to talk about negotiation. And then finally, if you want more help and assistance, or equally if you just want to pick up a document you can read, we've got a toolkit online. I've called it a manual here, and we've also got Excel tools that you can download from the website, which is www.city.ac.uk/CCE. That will come again at the very last slide so that you can pick it up there, but we have those tools available for you online. So the first thing I want to say is, why is this important? Because, as charitable organisations, civil society organisations, sometimes, we are conflicted between head and heart. This is Dadaab refugee camp. CARE used to provide food and water for Somali refugees, 500,000 of them every single day. And we've done so for the past 20, 25 years. And the interesting thing for me is, if you didn't actually have proper cost recovery, you didn't have enough money to feed people. And so, why does cost recovery matter? Because it actually links to the heart of what we do to help those that we exist for. And if we have more money, we can help people in a different way. So I really care deeply about this for the charity sector. So let's start by thinking about the funding landscape. Here on the first slide, you've got the funding trends. And I hear all the time from charities and non-profits that they're running out of money. Well, the top left-hand diagram shows otherwise. It comes from the NCV Almanac. That's where you can find the figures. So NCVO Almanac is, if you like, the best source of figures that you can find on finance in the charity sector. And it shows that since 2000, really to 2010, there was a 50% jump in the amount of money coming to the voluntary sector. It's leveled out a bit. But with that huge increase in money, what was really happening? Well, down to the bottom right-hand slide, the amount of government grants, this light blue line, was decreasing. The amount of contract-based money was increasing. And so what you've seen is a different type of money coming into the market and coming into charities, one that needs to be priced up properly because you get paid for the outputs, the outcomes you achieve, and let's say the number of people you help, which is different from a grant, which is a much softer way, or a donation, much softer way of actually doing work. So it's really important now with contracts, we understand our costs and we cover our costs and potentially even a profit as well. It's the same in the international space. What you're seeing at the bottom here is overseas development aid. That's the grants and the contracts that are coming from governments and also to NGOs. But what you're seeing across the rest of it, and it's this big red swathe, there's much more investment type money coming in, much more commercial type money. You need to be much better at cost recovery and understanding your costs to tap into this funding. So you can see that funding flows are changing. But I want to put it into context of the charity sector. Kids Company, it's well known, Alan Yentob, Camilla Batman-Gia, and the reasons why Kids Company went out of business from governance point of view. what I believe is that the overheads were, let's say, 7 to 10%, but what they really had was 20% overheads. So each time they were having a grant, they were not funding their infrastructure properly. That eventually led to the failure of Kids Company, as they effectively run out of money. Progressio is I think a little bit different, because Progressio was an agricultural organisation with turnover of about £20 million, and it had propped up its infrastructure, it had propped up its overheads, if you like, from a government grant. When that government grant went away, Progressio could not continue. It just didn't simply have the funds, and it hadn't absorbed it into its pricing or its costing structure. Therefore, it didn't have the money to continue, and it closed. It might have closed in a responsible way, but at the same time, it deprived a huge number of people with agricultural help. So cost recovery is incredibly important to achieve sustainability for organisations. So let's go on now to talk about what is cost recovery and why it's important. And the first thing is, why should you understand your cost base? I think that you should understand your cost base for 3 different reasons. The first is to run yourself effectively. If you don't know your overhead levels, how can you control that? And I'm actually in the space of, I think organisations need more overheads and need to be transparent about that to get the infrastructure they really need to deliver with quality. We need to have an understanding of cost bases to have conversations with funders about the real cost of doing business, and also about sustainability. So here's a simple example. Would you look backwards at your costs and look at historic information if you're changing significantly? Well, you might want to look forward and use budgets in the next year, because you might want to add in a finance person with a higher level of skill, maybe a strategic level of skill, which will help you to think around these things. But unless you put those into the budgets, for the next year, you won't actually have that money, and that could impact on your sustainability. So we're now at the point where we need to talk about definitions. Direct costs, indirect costs, direct support costs. Well, what do they mean? We're going to go to the bullets at the bottom. Direct costs are the costs of the activities, the work that you do that can be directly linked. So that might be salaries, staff, travel costs, right at the coalface. In other words, linking to the activities, the work that you do. Indirect costs, on the other hand, it's difficult to see, for example, how finance, IT, HR link to the work that we do. But if you remove those costs, it would remove the quality. And so these are the overheads, if you like, of the organisation, which we have to ensure are paid for properly. And then you've got this thing, direct support costs, and they're things like, for example, the building. They're messy, and the cost, you might want to move some of them into direct costs and some of it into indirect costs. You need to do some apportionment work there. And it might be, for example, you want to take the number of headcount working, and you can see that staff complement linked to the work that you do. In other words, the building cost links to the direct cost. You need to apportion it as such. So direct costs is this messy work we're going to have to do around apportioning things. So here's the first question for me. What are overheads? I mean, overheads are all of these things, but let's really think about this, because travel costs, for example, on the right-hand bullets in the middle, travel costs are for a certain purpose. They're for the activity. Well, clearly those link to the work that you do. It's a direct cost. Well, surely it should be allocated as such. Yeah. So maybe travel is not an overhead after all. It's a direct cost. The CEO's time or the managing director's time, some of the work that they do is directly linked to the projects. Well, it should be seen as such. Is that really an overhead? I think that's a direct cost. I'll give you another example, insurance. Insurance, people regularly say, is an overhead. But if you're having to get insurance to go and work in a certain context, or maybe with disability, it's a real cost of doing the work that you undertake and should be seen as a direct cost. And it goes all the way through to some of the more contentious areas like fundraising. If all you're doing is fundraising not for general purposes but specifically for a certain project, that's not a general cost. Yeah, it links directly to the activity or service. It should be charged as such. You can see what I'm trying to do with overheads is challenge how you're treating them, and we really should be moving overheads much more into direct costs. That's the journey we're going to go on. So what is full cost recovery? Well, start with cost recovery. It's ensuring that each activity or service is properly funded. Full cost recovery is making sure we break even. We can recover everything that we're due, including overheads. It is, therefore, the true cost of doing business. And you'll see that in the second bullet point. Pricing, on the other hand, is how much you charge for this. Yeah, and we'll come back and talk about that later. But what we're trying to fund is our services and activities on a sustainable basis. What's current charity practice? I mean, the first thing to say is, we work at the business school, we consult with a lot of different organisations. I think a third of all organisations are actually pretty good at cost recovery, really understand it. They could be better, but I think they're doing pretty well. I think, on the other hand, a third of all organisations that we work with charities really don't know their overhead percentage and really do need to, because it's business critical for them. And then in the middle, you've got about a third of all organisations that are kind of needing some confidence to go on this journey. That's what this webinar is actually helping. I see all the time charities putting forward their overheads at a fixed percentage, maybe 10 to 15%, what they think a funder will stand. The average overheads across all charities is about 14 to 15%. But let's think about, back to that refugee slide, if you're working in different contexts, you probably need more overheads, maybe 17%, 20%. You really do need to be able to justify that to the donor. So be transparent, don't hide the costs. And above everything else, if there's a subsidy that you are giving to a grant or a contract, be transparent around it. So let's just compare against other sectors for a couple of seconds. If you look at the general expenses and marketing, so we're not now just looking at overheads, we're looking at marketing as well. Banks, 28%, software companies, 47%. They're spending a considerable amount more than we are as non-profits and charities, spending about 10 to 20%. So back to this thing about spending more, I think we should actually be spending more on our infrastructures and justifying why we need this infrastructure to be able to provide a quality service. And over onto the next slide, the US has done some great research around what's called the starvation cycle. Inside NGO's report says that what you've actually got is charities misrepresenting, if you like, and hiding certain costs, funders therefore having unrealistic expectations, non-profits, charities feeling they have a pressure to conform, and this going round in a cycle. And I think, from the work that we've done here at the business school, there's a 5 to 10% subsidy on every single project we do, and that comes from unrestricted. And I think that to be sustainable, we need to absorb that back into our pricing. But the big thing that frustrates me, if you like, is the number of organisations I go to that just don't know the margins per activity that they have. So, for example, here you've got projects, grants, core, membership, and you look at the income and the expenditure against that. I know a lot of organisations I work with don't even look at the income less expenditure for the different types of work that they do. And if you look here at this diagram, you've got the orange box on the far right hand side. That is the overheads that needs to be apportioned across each of the different activities. If you think about projects and you apportion that orange box, projects become negative. In other words, when I showed this to the charity I was working with, they realised that they were making a loss from projects. They thought they were making a profit. Well, the numbers kind of showed that, but they weren't, because they had not apportioned their overheads. They had to go back and think about their business model and really start to push on cost recovery to claim that additional money. So cutting right to the heart of your organisations and making sure you get the money that you deserve is absolutely critical. So let's build a model. We talked about direct costs, we talked about direct support costs, we talked about indirect costs. What you are talking about, let's say here with a small organisation helping the elderly, is direct costs are handymen, lawnmowers, uniforms, property. Indirect costs are the governance, the IT, the finance. Direct support costs might be the regulation, the premises cost, telecoms. And we're going to try and move as much of the cost as we can upwards so that donors and funders can see that it links to the work that we do and are happy to fund that. But it's got to be done with the right balance so it doesn't look wrong. And, back to the average that I said about 14.5%, 15% overheads. If you've got 0.3% overheads, it seems quite small. Yeah, does that seem appropriate? And I'll give you a real example here. One organisation that I'm working with had overheads of 28%. The local authority said put in a bid and we'll pay about 15%, so they put in at 15%. And they completely hid the subsidy of 13%. They've now come to me to say, how do we sort out the business model because we're running out of money? There's another example, a charity that had 0.3% overheads in their reports and accounts. So transparently, they were saying 0.3% in their reports and accounts. They put forward at 15% overheads to the local authority. The local authority just picked up the reports and accounts and said, hang on, you've got 0.3% overheads, we're not going to pay that. We're not going to pay the 15% that you've asked for, and they're going out of business. So this is business critical, getting the balance right. So we're now on to allocation and apportionment. And, allocation is putting the costs into the big buckets. So direct costs, direct support costs, and indirect costs we've talked about. We're then going to apportion the overheads or the indirect costs. We're then going to actually apportion direct support costs into the different projects so we can see really how much they cost. And so we're going to allocate money and we're going to apportion money into the different projects to understand how much it really costs. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to apportion on basis like floor space for building, so you can see the head count or the floor space different things take. The chief executive's office, you might want to actually apportion against time. You've got the different things that you could actually focus on, to actually take the money and divvy it out and divide it out across the different services or the different projects. And what we find when we do consulting projects is there's typically 4 things wrong in terms of cost recovery. I mean, the first is that management information just might not be very good. Management information typically is what drives the organisation financially, and we quite often find that it's not produced on a timely basis and it's not particularly thought through, and therefore you can't make any decisions from that. So getting good management information is key with cost recovery. Secondly, the organisation doesn't understand its business model. So what you find is that information tends to come against cost centres like staff, travel, etc., rather than what really goes on in the activities. That is difficult, so that organisations can't see how they are actually providing and spending their money. And then the final thing is culture. A lot of organisations we work with see themselves as non-profits and don't feel it's appropriate to make a profit or to make a surplus or even to break even. Culturally, that needs to be addressed so that at least we break even with our work or understand why we're making a subsidy towards the work that we do. And over on the next slide, probably from about 150 charities, is a list of things that I know are regularly forgotten when we cost a project. Top left-hand box, shouting about our work, this advocacy, awareness, fundraising, branding costs, marketing costs. Business development costs are forgotten about. Next box down, irrecoverable VAT, the costs of property. You can see all of those costs. IT, HR, finance, legal is typically forgotten about. Top right-hand box, impact measurement, the costs of capturing data on outcomes and outputs, the costs of regulation, the next box down, and the costs of volunteers. These are all things that are often forgotten about and then become a real cost to our unrestricted reserves. But what we need to remember more than anything is we've got to have good quality management information to go on this journey. And the finance function, for example, on the right-hand side here, we've got to move out of being a scorekeeper to understand what operations, what fundraising really needs, and to become a business partner to provide that information. So I've got about another 5 minutes, I think, on the presentation here. Let's just quickly touch on costing versus pricing. Costing is what we've talked about so far, direct cost, direct support, indirect costs. Pricing then would add a risk and a contingency payment with that. And contingency, for example, you might be doing a new service, you might not know quite the number of people you're going to help. The government Green Book says that you can actually add on 10%, let's say, or 15%, whatever that contingency is, appropriate, so that you are making sure you cover your costs. Foreign exchange is another example. You might see GBP sterling going up and down against other currencies. You might want to put in a contingency against that. And then you've got the profit that you might want to add to this, a certain amount of profit to come to a price that you're going to charge. And I think charities almost feel embarrassed about asking for profit, but it's really important as we move into this contracting culture. So back to the start of the presentation, this move in money that's taking place. So my favourite conversation, day rates. And when you are talking about how many days you put your calculation over, so let's say you've got a certain amount, $20,000 for a person, and you're dividing it by a number of days, that comes to a day rate. Most charities that I work with put forward at 261 days, or 260 days. In other words, they just take into account the weekends. But that completely misses the fact that people can't work on bank holidays, can't work on holidays they're given, can't work on sick days. And equally, there are training days on charity business that are given, typically about 10%. And so 200 days is a much better basis to actually work your day rates on. And you can see there, that's probably about 30% more value. Alternatively, if you calculate on 70%, or let's say utilization, 70 to 80% is typically appropriate, you've got 183 days. So the cost of that staff member divided by 200 or 183 days is much more cost recovery than if you divide it by 261. I hope you can see that, but it's really important. I'm just going to have 2 seconds to touch on negotiation, and it's a critical part of cost recovery, because once you've seen how much something costs, you've got to go and negotiate with your funder or donor. Create the win-win, understand how much it's really going to cost you, and be transparent and also be open about any subsidy. And then you will know your lowest acceptable bid. Be known to your funder, work up and have a communication, work very closely with them, understand your USP. And it's interesting, working with commissioners, they say that charities are particularly bad at telling their story about how they create social change, and also they never see any testimonials, so they just then treat them the same as a commercial business. We're not. We create something wonderful, let's tell our story better about the hardest to help, and also put in some testimonials. But the key here in negotiating is just about being transparent and really having the confidence that you know your costs when you go into to negotiate, and you will get more money. One organisation that I've been working with had the thought that their overheads were 10%, recut their numbers, 15% overheads. They had £1 million bid, walked to their local authority funder and got £50,000 more, because they were able to tell their story and show and demonstrate how they'd done the numbers. So, final slide, what are you going to take away from this? Well, the first thing from me is I want you to get the model right and don't fear the numbers. This is critical for you in the future in terms of sustainability. And you know what? Most funders that we work with want to pay a fair proportion of overheads, want to give you the money and the infrastructure costs, but don't have the confidence in the calculations you've done. So don't fear the numbers. Get the management information right. Get it so that you can justify and show any subsidy. Number 2, know your overheads. It's just important, for internal management and also for efficiency. Ensure that you count all costs. Don't forget anything, and be transparent with any subsidy. And make sure that trustees sign this off appropriately if it is a big shortfall. Ensure that core grants, in other words, these core grants that prop up, if you like, business models, are covered, and also that the costs of those are absorbed into your services. Negotiate transparently and openly. And as Tim Boyes-Watson from Humentum says, mind the gap, close the gap. Finally, from me, good luck. I just want to say in closing, I hope you've enjoyed that half hour. For me, this is absolutely critical, because as social purpose organisations and charities, we are worth it. We are sometimes backwards and coming forwards in asking for the money. I really want us to do better. I want us to have more money to be more sustainable, so that we can help more of those people that we exist for. My details are here. If you want to get in contact with me, feel free. And just thank you for listening. Thank you.